our Design Shop Talk, where we try to get together on a regular basis to answer any questions you might have. I do have some questions that were typed in from last time and whatever, and on some of the posts around the internet, so I'll get to those first. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in on the video, and I will see what I can do to get them answered. So let me get my screen set up so I can actually see questions. So give me 1 second. Click on that.
Questions you might have.
Mute. There. Okay. So it looks like it's all working. Again, if you have any comments, type them straight in and hopefully I'll see them to get them answered. So to start off with, what questions do we have? First one was, how would we tackle the word legend? I just cropped this down from a picture that was left on the thread. And then another was, how do you do shadows on faces? So this is what they were working on. This is what they created and said, well, you know, how would I do the shadowing and the shading different? So let's start with those, and then we'll come back to questions and see what else we have. So to start off with legend. So I wasn't sure how big that was. I assumed it was tiny. So beforehand, I went ahead and digitized it fast, just so that you could see how I do it. There's a bunch of different ways to digitize things like this, but let's start off with this fill first. So when you're digitizing for a hat, one of the things you need to make sure you do is it goes center out from bottom to top. This is just a filled rectangle. So what do you do with that? So remember, it needs to go center out. So that's the same with the underlay, with everything. So what I would suggest is digitizing it manually. So this is just a complex fill. All right, so a complex fill is this guy right here. So if you click on that, I'm just draw a rectangle. All I'm doing here is duplicating what I already did just above it. All right, now obviously that doesn't look like this. So I'm going to go into the properties, change that to a stitch direction of 0, and yep, it's all still working. And let's say a density of 20. I'm going to turn off the underlay since I'm creating it manually. And then I'm also going to turn on Trapunto. There. So 20 isn't the same, whatever, 30. Anyway, you get the idea. You can also turn on Trace Border if you want, and that will actually run an outline around your shape as well. Okay, so that I needed to go from center out. So let's change my start to here, my stop to here. And then I'm going to do a walk because now I need to go the other direction. So I'm going to do another walk stitch and then digitize the same thing, just going the opposite way. So I've got my walk, I've got this thing, it starts here, it ends there. Then I'm going to walk from the propeller, which is where my previous elements ended, walk down towards the center again. So now if I want to cheat, I can just duplicate this, because who doesn't like doing things faster, right? So if I duplicate that, mirror it, hold my alternate key down on my keyboard, click and drag, look what happens. Now I've got another rectangle that starts. So if I click on it, it starts where my green circle is, it ends over here. All right, so now what can we do? So I have this guy, I walk down, I created that guy. So it ends up here. Why don't I do a walk down to the bottom? And from here, I just like securing the tops and the bottoms. It's a personal preference. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do this. But if I do a single line, oops, cancel that. All right, so I did a single line, which that's a little ridiculous. I can change it to tackle, maybe do it a little bit with the density a little bit smaller than that. So maybe change this to stupid number lock. My number lock does not want to cooperate with me today. 1, 4. There. How many times can I hit numlock? All right. So secure the bottom. Do the same thing on the top. So walk up, and again, I just like copying and pasting. So, you know, copy, paste, click, drag it to the top. I did a mirror right here so that my start would come over. I don't have to do that. You could have just clicked a new start and stop point and gotten the same result. So there. Now I've got that. So now all we need is the actual fill. Okay, so I'm going to do another walk down. I guess I didn't need that first walk down, but well, there we go. So now I have my walk. I can do my complex fill. Maybe going from, oops. I'm going to click on that rectangle and go like that. And now I have my fill. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. All right, so now I digitize a fill that sews center out. Oops, let's watch how it sews. So it sews center, goes, oops, I don't need all that extra underlay, so I'm going to go delete that. I said oops a lot today. Sorry about that. So none, because we did that all by ourselves. And then I'm going to move my start down there. Check my work to make sure I don't have any trims, which I have a trim before this fill, so I need to move my start and stop around or change my properties to get rid of that. So that's one change I still would need to make. But you can see on what I did earlier, there's no trims on there. All right, so that's kind of where I'd start, making sure you go center out. Now with the text, when I did this earlier, the way I chose to do it was to let me move this guy up. There. Okay. I just used a basic font, not knowing what font it was, and I assumed this was going to be small, so I just did it as a tiny microblock font. And to flip the E, I'll do that for this one here. Notice when you type in the text, you get these little black X's on all of them. If you click on one, right there, down here where you've got your mirror, I can mirror it and then just drag it around to where I want it. Okay, so that's how you can flip them around if you're going to use a standard font. If you're not, then you just use your columns and your walks and whatnot to go ahead and digitize your lettering. Okay, so there was that question. The other one was, how do I do, I did this, how do I do shading a little bit better? Now with shading, that's all about layering up your threads, right, to get them to blend and to look like they're blending well. Nate did a really good video where he was working on a horse. It was a Wednesday video. I'll see if we can get the link put in here, where he kind of talks about how you stack those layers up to get that effect. I did go ahead and I happened to digitize this dude for my son this week, actually, so I thought it was funny. This was one of the examples that was asked about. But where is it? There it is. All right, so file, open. I cut out the rest of the stuff and just left his face so we have something to talk to. All right, so it's the colors I use. You don't see much of a blend, but that's when you're trying to get that shading look. What you really want to do is take your different threads, look at how they go next to each other, make sure that you're not going from really unsaturated to saturated, things like that, so that you can get them nicely blended. And you would start off by digitizing whatever the face was in your base color. Okay, so this is just a basic fill. You can see it's a complex fill. It's just got all the stitches running pretty much top to bottom. Then what I always like to do is copy and paste that same shape. That way my stitch directions are all the same, but now you want to play with your densities. And that's because you don't want to just stack fill after fill on top of one another, because you're not going to get that blend effect. You want to see some of the lighter color underneath it and some of the darker color that you're putting on top, or vice versa, whatever colors you're doing. So here I copied and pasted and then just went through the under effects, turned on this custom density so that I could have more stitching on one side, less stitching on the other, and then just play with the different settings. All right, that way it'll look more peach on this side, more shaded on this side. All right, and you can keep playing with that to go as dense as you want it to go at, let's say you want more pink on one side, or maybe more open on the other side, so you can open it up. So you can play with all these settings, and I usually just mess with it until I like how it looks. Once I get it looking reasonable on my screen, at that point I'll go sew it out and see if it actually works with the thread colors I've selected. Okay, so when you're doing shading, that's kind of the activity you're going to work on, is play with your stitch lengths. Remember, the shorter a stitch length, the more it's going to vary. So if you're layering up from bottom to top, you'd have shorter stitch lengths to help force it down. and, you know, force the stitching into it to kind of force the blend. All right. Now, another thing I did want to point out when doing stuff like this, or this particular one, I noticed you had pretty much a solid fill done for these different areas. You can add a lot of interest and just kind of make it look more like the character by actually taking the time, rather than digitizing that all as just as flat fill. Go ahead and use your columns to kind of make it look like hair, right? So one technique you can do is, rather than worrying about your columns filling in everything, do a base coat. Okay, so let me turn off these guys so you can actually see it. There. So this is the base color that's going to peek through everything. So just sew it as a solid fill, and because other stitching is going to be on top of it, you don't have to do it super tight, right? So you can have a looser density on that, because you're going to be layering different things on top of it. But you can see those colors still peek through. So that's just a different technique you can use there. Okay, so blends, that's all. It's really just about working through them all. There's a few others that I had to bring up, like this blend example here. You can do, this is the same shape blended different ways, right? So when you're doing shadows on faces, it's the same general technique. You're gonna play with your densities from one side to another. That was different. Sorry. So you're gonna play with the densities from one side to another, making sure you're layering the different colors on there, right? And you don't even have to go through it and do them, you know, as solid things like this. You can actually change the shapes and make them random so that you get a different blend. So when you're doing shading on different faces and whatnot, you know, check your different skin tones to make sure you're going slightly darker. That would be closer to a shade. And then add that randomization in there so you kind of get that layering. Like I said, Nate did a really good video on this where specifically talked about blending things like that. Okay. Let's see. Can you turn the beep off on the Maya? No, you can't turn the beep off. I've seen pretty funny ways people have turned it down. I don't suggest those, but it's literally getting to the main board and messing with the speaker. Not a good idea. So, no, you can't turn it off. It's there. How do you digitize a vector? Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, this one real quick. Is there any way I can use my DesignShop Pro 9 to send my designs to my Happy Embroidery machine? Absolutely. So DesignShop is just a universal digitizing software, right? You can digitize for any machine. So whatever format you can't send it from DesignShop to your embroidery machine. However, let's say your machine uses an EXP format. You would save off your EXP, and then however you would normally load designs onto your machine, you would then go load that design and take the file that you saved off and load it. Okay. Any comments yet? I don't see any. Okay. So, all right, so let's go look at the vector, and then I'll also show how to do a template, how to set up your presets. All right, DesignShop, here we are. So digitizing a vector, it depends on what type of vector you want to digitize, right? So I can take any shape that is a vector. Let me close all this. All right, so let's say I've got a vector square, and then a vector circle. Okay, whatever your shapes are, right? So the only difference between these vectors and a sew file is you can add a stitch direction. So if you select your vector, click over here, insert stitch direction, I can left click and drag, and now that's something that will sew. You can do that same thing on the circle. I can select my stitch direction, left click and drag, and now I've got two shapes that are no longer vectors. They're actually digitized with thread. Now, if you've got more complex shapes, and what you're really asking is how do I digitize from a vector design? So if I go to my C drive, designs, graphics, let's see, coffee cup. Let's open that one. That's a vector file. All right, I'm going to turn off the bitmap. So I've got this vector file here, right? So you can of course auto convert it, but I always prefer selecting the vector, choosing my insert stitch direction, and then adding the stitch directions that I want. Okay, so let's say I've got that one. I can go add a stitch direction across this guy, maybe 2, so the stitches kind of sweep around. And just work your way through there. Like this did something weird with the starts and stops, so I would actually go change that. So ooh, let's get rid of that. So select the shape, click on a start and a stop. That's better. Okay, so when you're working with vectors, I like doing it that way. Just select each element individually, digitize it by adding your stitch directions, adding splices if needed, things like that. Now you can of course come over to it and click on convert to from embroidery and basically see what you get, right? And depending on the quality of the vector artwork and how it was done, it may convert beautifully or it may be more work with other. But if you're going for speed or just to get a quick estimate on how many stitches that design might be, that's an easy way to do it. Okay. So the other question we had was, oh, how to make a template again so my tie-ins will be automatic when I start a new file. All right, so whatever your preferences are for your tie-ins and tie-outs, what type of underlay you like, those sorts of things, what I always suggest doing is starting from a new file. What that will allow you to do is see what your current defaults are. And then once you're in a new file, I can, for instance, right-click on lettering. That will bring up my object property box, and now whatever I see here in this box are what my current defaults are. So if I look at underlay, I currently have auto underlay turned on. I have my tie-ins and tie-offs turned on with the auto trim set to 20. That's what's going to govern how far apart things need to be before it trims. So 20 points is pretty small. I think the default is 64, which is close to a 1/4 of an inch. 64 to me is way too big. Most people seem to prefer somewhere between 20 and 30 points for most things. So whatever it is you want, you can add some pull offset. Just change these to be whatever you like. So what your preferences are, and you'll find every digitizer has different preferences. We all have little tweaks of things we like different. Once you're done making all the changes to what you want it to be, right here you would say save current settings to defaults, save to defaults permanently, or for only current document, well, we want it to save defaults permanently. You'd say okay for that. And now when you start a new file, those will be your defaults. Okay. Now that only works for new files. So when you start a new file, the defaults that are there will be whatever you set your current defaults to. Now, if you're working with a file that was generated before creating all those, well, now you're into whatever the defaults were for that file. All right. So just keep that in mind. So if you want to set things up, you can also, let's say you're going to set up a standard name, right? Or a standard monogram, whatever it's going to be, and you want it to be a specific font for whatever customer you're going to work on, a certain size, different settings, all of that. You would go through and set that all up. Once you're done, save it off as a template so that when it's all said and done, I can double click on it, change my text, and call it good. Okay. See y'all. Still no comments. All right. Well, hopefully you guys hear me. Okay, so there is that. What else do we have? Maybe it's been covered already, but editing, I assume that's files and expanded format. Expanded file editing is not for the faint. It's probably one of my least favorite activities to do, just in general, because expanded formats, what those are is you don't have any wireframes. There's no smarts to it. So, oops, where is it? There it is. Let's open that one. All right, so it's literally just a set of coordinates. So when you open here, you'll see it says expanded. Well, that means there's no wireframe, there's no properties. It literally is what you see over here, which is a bunch of coordinates of where needle penetrations go, and so where the machine's going to go to stitch your file out. You'll see now that all those little dots are individual needle penetrations, right? So if I want to move things around, I would go left click on it, left click and drag. Now, should I do this? No, because what am I doing? I'm creating these really ridiculously long stitches, which that's no good, right? So you would have to add additional stitches on there, and now I'm just eyeballing it. It's probably not consistent, those sorts of things. So when you're doing expanded file editing, you want to, do whatever tools you need to be able to help control your stitch lengths and things like that. One of the main things I tend to use it for is just cleaning up stuff. So if there's jump stitches or random stitches off in the middle of a file, that's what I'll tend to edit, rather than doing things like this where I'm stitch by stitch modifying where it stitches. But sometimes if you only have a small area to modify, rather than converting it over into a wireframe. Oh, Dan tells me you guys are posting questions and I don't see them. Why don't I see them? Let's see if they come back when I click. Well, he sent them to me, so let's see what we got. Questions. What kind of stitch do you use for designs that have small details like skull? Size of 1 inch looks good on Digitizing, but when I run a test run, it looks all bunched up in areas and it shreds the files. Thank you, Dan. All right, so I'll keep that open in case there's others for me. So the question was, what do you do for designs that have small details? So in those sorts of things, when you're dealing with minis, you want to look at the length of the stitch, right? So if I'm using a small skull, I'm trying to think if I have any skulls that I can get to without thinking about it. Not really. Okay, so we said it's 1 inch. All right, so I'm going to quick draw a box. Actually, I'm just going to turn on the grid. That'll be easier. All right, so I've got a grid. There's a 1 inch square right here. And if I wanted to draw a skull, what I need to think about is the length of the stitch. Your needles are roughly 7 to 8 points, depending on what size needle you're using. So what you don't want to do is stitching like this, where I'm going point to point back and forth, where I'm doing like 3 points, right? When you do things like that, it's just not going to work out well because your needle's wider than the hole you're punching in the fabric. So your machine's hardly moving enough to allow a clean stitch to be made, right? So when you're doing those sorts of things, think about that. So when I'm going to go, if I were just going to digitize a skull, and I really wish I had one to trace at the moment, but I'm just going to do this. It's going to be a goofy looking one. All right, an ugly looking one. Let's be honest. Okay, so I've got this. I'm going to quick try to fix it so it looks more skull-like and less ugly-like, but I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Oh, that's miserable. Let me go. Whatever. All right, so we've got a hole. We got a hole. I'm going to add some eyeballs to it using my circle tool. This is awful. I can't. Just let me go find a picture. Skull. Clip art. That was awful. I'm sorry. Here, this one's cute. I'm going to copy that. No, not the link. Copy image. Okay, now that I am I'm going to do something I can actually trace. And go figure, it's small. All right, so let's do that. All right, I'm going to trace it. And these are larger areas, right? So I can handle those as a fill. But if, let's say I wanted to add detail for, let's say, the, I'm going to add teeth or something like that on here. Well, in that case, I wouldn't want to do those as satin stitches because the stitches would be too small. So what I would want to do is consider using those as like a bean stitch. So let's say I wanted to add little teeth marks going up here. I would just go ahead and add a bean stitch around the edge and come through here and add my little points. So if I go like that, you'll see in a moment what this is actually doing. I add multiple points so that I can drag this up, and what that does, it's going to go back and over it. Okay. So again, I'm trying to make the stitches long enough to where you don't end up with tiny little stitches all over the place. Ooh, I can actually see a question. I'm trying to digitize something that looks like the top of an A or a skinny triangle. I put a satin stitch around it and it goes to the corner. Yeah, I'll show you. We'll do that in a second. So, you know, specific to this question of what sort of details would you put, what stitch types would you use? Well, I would just use a fill stitch for some of this stuff, and then use your running stitches for others, right? So the running stitches, let's say this skull, if you did it as satin and you measured across it, or this part here, and you went, oh wait, that's only 6 points across. Well, rather than that, why not do it as a set of walk stitches? So you can go over it different ways and it will end up filling in. So if it's really narrow, doing those sorts of things helps you get the stitches without having a whole bunch of needle penetrations in a small area causing you problems. Okay. I'll change that to black. There, now I have little teeth. So I would stay away from satins when you get super small unless you're specifically paying attention to the size of them, right? You don't want any of these stitches getting super tiny the whole way. You're looking at digitizing corners, and the corners are looking ugly. So that was a question that was just typed in. Let me go. I have an example in my teaching examples, corners. Here. Okay. So I think what you're saying is, hey, I'm doing something like this and it's bunching. And why is that? Because as it's sewing, it's going around this corner, it's always coming back to this one spot here. Well, when you go to sew that, is that going to sew out well? Not really. It's going to look more like a mushroom because you're putting too many stitches in here. What are the different techniques you can do to address that? Well, first off, you can go into the properties of that item, and right here under corners, you can turn on the corners. So just doing that, they have different styles of corners that you can do that will end up creating a miter. So there's one, or you can change it to a different type where it's like an overlap of single line centers. Or maybe you don't like the miter look at all, maybe you want to cap it. All right. Now the corners tool is a software or a level dependent feature. So you do want to pay attention to that. If you don't have it, are you stuck? No, it just means you have to digitize it by hand, right? So again, here are some examples that I did that same thing, but as a single line center, which is this guy right here. So you would just draw your single line center and then draw your next one, paying attention to your starts and stops. And that gives you like a type 2 miter. Well, here, if rather than doing this as a single line, if I did it as a complex fill, so I'll trace it just so you can see that. I'm going to do complex fill, trace the shape, hit enter. I'm going to give it a start. Oops, I don't have any holes. Give it a start, a stop, a stitch direction. All right, so then I'm going to change it to satin and add additional stitch directions. Well, now I get this weirdness here, but if I come up here and say insert splice and insert a splice across there, hey, look at that. Now I have what looks like that miter. Okay, so you can, there are other ways you can do it without using corners. It's just more clicking. So if you want to, by using the corner tool, if you have that level, it can increase your productivity and just make your digitizing faster. Okay, Dan, what other ones were sent in that I can't see? Oh, yeah, Shauna, I have another one. I have that on another slide about the Richardson hats, so I'll get there. Maybe it's been, all right, so we did expanded. So how many clicks up and active feed for Richardson hats? What machine? I don't know if we have a link. If not, I can see if we can get one put up on the different settings for that. But typically with hats, it really depends on how well you hoop, what hoop you're using, which hat you're using, so structured versus unstructured. So with the Richardson, I assume you are talking about those really fun structured hats that everyone seems to love. You know, I would suggest starting with maybe 3 to 5 clicks up from the bottom as a starting point, and then listen to it. If it's hammering real hard, you can pick up the foot a little bit more. If there's too much flagging, maybe consider hooping it a little bit tighter to get the hat a little bit lower. For your active feed for hats, you know, I would suggest starting at, well, usually I would say 6 to 8 as the minimum starting point, but with the new machine you got to add 5 to 7 points on top of that. So, you know, that's something to think about anyway. Which machine you have. If you've got the new X, I would probably start at 15, 12 to 15, somewhere in there. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions? Now that I've jumped all over the place, and I'll see if Dan sent me any others. Okay, I answered that one. What needle size would I use for that legend text? It depends on what I'm sewing it on. So that legend example that I used, you know, honestly, I sew a lot of tiny lettering using a 7511 needle. Is that the best needle for the job? No. 65.9 is better. But if I'm going to be sewing on a hat, I'll tell you, I don't enjoy using tiny needles on hats. So I probably would try for 7511 or maybe a size 70. You can always get small text looking cleaner by, one, changing your needle to go a little bit smaller, and also using a 60 weight thread instead of a 40 weight thread. So that is also always a good call, is reducing your thread size. So Dan, did you send me any others? So I got those. See if there's a show all at the bottom. He's telling me how to maybe see comments. No, it doesn't show me that, Dan. I'm sorry. Okay, so those were the questions I've seen. So, oh, I need to adjust kerning smaller than it is allowing to me to do. How do I do that? All right, so let's see. Do I still have legend up? No. So let's go open that. Open legend. All right. So let's say I'm going to copy paste, move it up here. Nope, that's what I'm going on to now is the kerning question. All right. So let's say we've got this and you've come into it, you've gone into spacing, you've turned on auto kern, and you've changed it to whatever you want, and you're still unhappy, you still want to tweak different things about it. What do? Well, there's a few different ways you can address it. And that would be, first is right here, which is manual kerning. So what that allows you to do is between letters, I'm just going to overdo it. Notice I clicked that a bunch. And what that did is it adjusted the kerning one direction. Here, I can do it the opposite direction if I want it to go the other way. Okay, so now I've got my L and the E overlapping. Probably not the look I want, but so you can do little small tweaks along here by using these manual kerns between your letters. So literally you would just click between it. Every place you want to make an adjustment, you would add a click. So when I'm making global changes across kerning, that, a long line of text or something like that, I'll do it either using the auto or this way. Because if I do it manually by adjusting these boxes, which you can do, right? So I select the text, left click on one of these X's, and then I can left click and drag. All right, so if I manually drag that around, that's cute, except, well, let's say I move this one, and now I move that one. Well, what happens? I'm having to perpetually update it every time I make a change. I'm having to change the ones downstream from that. So if I use those manual kerning in the properties, I kind of avoid that. So that is what I would suggest. So if you used auto kerning, you've done the nudges, and you still want to make tweaks to where things are positioned, there we go, you would literally just left click on each of these X's, drag them around. Now what happens if you want to get it off the baseline? up and down versus just side to side. Well, in that case, on your keyboard, click on the control key, and now I can get it off the baseline while the control is held. Once that's there, now it holds it to the baseline. And remember, you can still scale, rotate, and do all that fun stuff. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Let's see if I missed any others. No, we talked about that. Did Kerning, talked about that, talked about that. I think I got them all. Yeah. All right, so let me see if Dan sent me anything else. Nope. Okay. Any other questions? I can see a few. So if there are, let me know. But remember, you can send all your questions in to applications@melco.com. You can type them in on these threads, either on the Melco International page. Wherever we see the questions, we'll try to get them in here. I know some of these I actually pulled from the video from last week that were asked after we had already ended. Okay. Well, I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. I will be back next Friday to answer any questions you might have. So send them in so I have something to talk to. All right. You guys have a fantastic weekend. Oh, Dan sent me something. One more. Okay. How can I change the color of each letter? I like that. I use that a lot. All right. So let's say you wanted every other letter to be something else, or maybe you want this to be a rainbow. So first off, click on the text you want to modify. Then the letter you wish to change, click on it, that little black X. So there, I'm going to change that to orange. I'm going to change this one to yellow. I'm going to click on the E, change that to green. You can see all I'm doing is choosing from the color palette over here. And now I have different color changes that I can then go modify to be whatever color I want. Okay. So I think that is everything. Again, my name is Samantha, and I will be back next Friday to see what else we can cover. Now, there was one question on, sorry, I forgot to put this one on, and I don't want to, I want to say I didn't forget about it, but I don't have an example, so I need to work on one this week for you about how to use the cross-stitch tool. So the cross-stitch tool is this thing right here. So that was asked, hey, can we go over an example of how you would use that to create different cross-stitch? I didn't get done making an example, and I think it would be better if we actually worked through an example rather than me just clicking around on the screen. So I didn't forget about you. We will go over that hopefully next time. All right. Or maybe I'll talk to the guys, see if anyone wants to do that as a Wednesday one instead. But either way, we'll make sure to get that on our list for y'all. Okay. So I will talk to you next time. Have a good weekend. Stay safe and all that fun stuff. And I'll be back. All right. Bye.